One fire is not like the other. But in what ways do they differ? And what causes these differences? To fully understand this, we must learn how to describe a fire by its characteristics. So today, we're going to learn 3 characteristics of a wildfire and how they are influenced by their environment. We can first describe a fire by its intensity. So that's the amount of heat energy released over a given time and area. So some fires may be characterized as low intensity fires, others as high. Obviously, high intensity fires will release much more energy in the same time frame and area than a low intensity fire. But why are some fires more intense than others? This depends on many factors, but here's a couple important ones. In the first place, there's fuel, right? More fuel means more potential for fire, meaning higher intensity. But the dryness of the fuel can also be important, right? Dry fuels burn easier than wet fuels. But there are also factors besides the fuel. Wind can transport more oxygen to a fire, but also move the fire itself, preheating neighboring fuels so that they burn easier. And topography can cause a similar effect, right? Plants uphill can be preheated easier than plants downhill. Follow me? Okay, remember the definition of intensity. It's about the amount of energy released over a given time and area. So the other 2 characteristics are related to that. In terms of area, a fire can be described by its spread or extent. The most important factor that affects the spread is fuel continuity. Think of a fire as a chain reaction, right? If there is a lot of surrounding fuel, then the fire can easily spread from one place to the next. But if the fire can't connect to surrounding fuels, then it's not likely to spread very far. And here, topography can play a role, right? A river between surrounding fuels can act as a fire break. Now the last important fire characteristic is related to time, the fire frequency. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate why it's important to also consider time, or frequency. Consider an ecosystem that is suddenly hit by a very high intensity fire. Most affected plants are killed, but luckily they have seeds stored in the soil, which sprout up immediately after the fire. But if a low intensity fire happens right after, so before the plants have reached maturity, this can lead to massive extinction, because now there are no seeds left anymore. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the low intensity fire had a much more destructive effect on the population than the high intensity fire. But this is caused by a short amount of time between 2 fires, so a high fire frequency. The fire frequency is mainly determined by 2 things: the amount of fuel that has accumulated since the last fire and the frequency of ignitions, right? Because ultimately that's what's going to decide when a fire happens. So there you have it, 3 very important characteristics of a fire: the intensity, spread, and frequency. And if you put all these together, you can construct sort of a historical fire pattern for a certain area. And that is what we call a fire resume. CBD stands for Central Business District, which means we're now in the heart of the metropolis. So this is pretty much the furthest thing from a suburb when it comes to Melbourne. But we can't talk about Melbourne without covering the CBD. So, next up, right there in the background, Queen Victoria Market, named of course after Queen Victoria. So next to having some fresh produce at your local market over here, there are also sometimes night markets, which, as I've been told, are sometimes European themed. So, to be continued. So the cool thing about the CBD is that there's actually a free tram zone. So as long as you're inside that zone, you can use the tram at no cost. So that building on the opposite side of the street, that's Southern Cross Station, one of the 2 major train stations here in the CBD. The other one is called Flinders Station, which you can easily reach from Southern Cross over here. So let's go! So that's Flinders Street Station. And you know what the cool thing is? Right when you step outside of Flinders Street, you can find Federation Square on the opposite side of the road. So Fed Square is like the center of major events here in Melbourne, right? So there's a main stage, as you see right there, and there's also a big screen on which they show major events such as the AFL Grand Finals, which you saw earlier. And I reckon they are also going to show the Australia matches in the World Cup soon, as well as the Australian Open matches, right? So when it comes to events here in Melbourne, Federation Square is the place to be. And as you make your way down from Fed Square, you can get to this other huge square called Birarung Mar. And as you see, it's completely empty right now, but wait until November, because that's when the night noodle market is hosted here, as well as some Christmas events later on. Our last site of the day, guys. Believe it or not, right next to the busy, sprawling central business district over there, we can actually find the Royal Botanic Gardens of Melbourne. But I'll probably leave that for our next episode. On Monday, 27 September, I went on an excursion to the Winton Wetlands on the invitation of my supervisor, who was teaching the subject ecological restoration. Fun fact, what we would call a course is what they call a subject over here in Australia. A course is actually the same as what we would call a degree. So ecology and evolution would actually be my course. Anyway, the Winton Wetlands are found up north, about 200 kilometers northeast of Melbourne. It's a large restoration project. So back in the 70s, this swamp area flooded, creating Lake Mokoan, or Winton, as a result. And at the time, there was a lot of economic interest for the lake, from irrigation to recreation. But at the same time, the flooding meant the death of nearly 200,000 native river red gums. So over time the lake started drying out, and eventually they found out it was losing more water than it was actually providing for irrigation. So they stopped maintaining the lake and turned it into a wetland. And since 2010, the Winton Wetlands Committee is tasked with management of this wetland. And just for some context, there are many types of wetlands. Some are constantly flooded, and some cycle between flooded and dry. Now Winton Wetlands belongs to the last one. So the key to managing this area is to control the water balance. Anyway, one of the main goals is to keep the ecological integrity of this area, and this is done by protecting and reintroducing threatened species, among others. Here's some examples that our guides, Lance and Lisa, talked about. So protection of native species is key, so management includes planting of river red gum and kangaroo grass, which has the added benefit that it makes these wetlands store a huge amount of carbon. And some of the trees here have nest boxes. Now usually nest boxes are inhabited by birds, but not these ones. These nest boxes are home to mammals, like the yellow-footed antechinus and the possum. But the wetlands are home to endangered birds too, like the Australasian bittern and the Latham snipe. See, that's what I like about Australia so much. For so many animal species that we have in Europe, there is some distant relative here in Australia that's very similar. And our wetlands in the Netherlands, for example, are also home to our own bitterns and snipes. There are also big conservation projects on reptiles and amphibians. The wetlands support numerous turtle species, which are mainly threatened by foxes, which are invasive, and car traffic. And at the education center, they actually have a nursery for the endangered growler frog. And of course, since we're in a wetland, we also can't forget about the aquatic ecosystem. So, there are fish restoration projects going on for the purple spotted gudgeon and the southern pygmy perch, both native and endangered. And next to that, a lot of effort is put into the removal of invasive carp. So, there's a lot going on to manage this area, but results are visible. The wetlands are home to healthy kangaroo and wallaby populations, and you bet I saw my first kangaroos today. Good evening up above us! So, after an exciting field trip at the Winton Wetlands and seeing my very first kangaroos in my life, we've now arrived in Wangaratta, which is where our hotel is, since we're staying the night, because tomorrow we're going on another field trip for the Regent Honeyeater project. Anyway, the city of Wangaratta is one of the many places that you'll pass if you ever travel from Melbourne to Sydney, or the other way around. So, since I'm here anyway, I thought maybe I'll just walk around and show you some of the highlights of this city. next day we went to Benalla, near the Winton Wetlands, for the Regent Honeyeater project, led by Andy and Josh. Out of all the birds that belong to the temperate woodland community, the Regent Honeyeater is the rarest of them all. So the habitat of the Regent Honeyeater is called a box ironbark forest.
Whoa! These birds live in boxes, man?
Alright, so remember that I talked about stringy barks the last time? Well, just like stringy barks, boxes and ironbarks are named after features of their bark. So boxes have a box-like pattern on their bark, while the bark of an ironbark resembles an iron slag. So the box ironbark forest is a forest type with an overstory of boxes and ironbarks. But these forests have been in severe decline, which has led to the decline of the Regent Honeyeater as well. So the main goal is to revegetate areas into box ironbark forests. But be wary. You can't just start planting boxes and ironbarks everywhere and expect the Regent Honeyeater to do well. You need to make some careful considerations. For example, if you have too many trees, then they will start competing with each other and never turn into suitable habitat for the Regent Honeyeater. And in addition, if the forest is too dense, there's a high chance that the Regent Honeyeaters will be chased off by noisy miners. These are also called bully birds. They are very common and very aggressive. So, we actually got a little job. This box ironbark forest was unfortunately too dense, so to make the habitat suitable for Regent Honeyeaters, we marked some of the trees so they would be removed. This allows for the ones left standing to turn into a healthy box ironbark forest suitable for Regent Honeyeaters. Two days after returning from Benalla, I went to Yarra Ranges with Ben Wagner, whom you've met, and botanist Harry Barton. Summary of this adventure.
Road closed again! Debris! More debris! Chainsaw! Debris cleared! I give up.
Nah, I'm just kidding. Eventually we got to our plots and did the fieldwork for one of Ben's alpine ash projects. However, that's not what I'm gonna talk about in this video. For that, I'll be making a separate video. Doesn't mean that there's nothing to talk about. So, because the road was closed, there was an opportunity to check out the Rainforest Gallery, which was nearby. This is a boardwalk that overlooks and runs through the local rainforest here. If you ever want a good impression of the forest that I work in, but not get lost in a never-ending maze, you should definitely visit. You might even get lucky and find a lyrebird singing right in front of you. And also, during our search for the right way, we came across the O'Shanassy Reservoir. This is a man-made water reservoir and dam, which provides water supply for Melbourne. The view was just so breathtaking that, after numerous failed attempts to reach our plots, we stopped here and set up for lunch. Later, we managed to find the right way to the plots, which required 3 gates to access it, which had to be opened and locked 3 times, both to go in and out. Anyway, when we reached our plots, we did our fieldwork, but the research itself, that'll come in a later video. Now you know I've been training religiously for the plunge, right? So on Saturday 10th of October, this suddenly happened. Now this straddle plunge is not perfect by any means, but goodness me if this isn't my best attempt yet. That's all I really wanted to share. But since I realized I never actually mentioned my workout regimen, I figured I shortly will. I always start out with 3 sets of my most advanced isometric progression, which in my case is this fake straddle plunge. Then 3 sets of dynamic strength work with tuck planche push-ups or pseudo planche push-ups, and finish it up with 3 sets of complementary exercises like dragon flex for core or planche knees. And the idea behind this regimen is that you familiarize your mind and body with the right position, but also build up strength to actually hold the planche. That's all for now, up abovers. Your Australian words for the day are ute and yui. 2 words that are pretty related, but where you probably have no idea what it actually means. Well, what you do know is that Aussies like to shorten words. So ute is short for utility vehicle. So it's basically a car that's made to perform tasks that normal passenger cars cannot, like the 4-wheel drive we used to reach our plots on the off-road tracks. But when we took a wrong turn in the Yarra Ranges, we had to turn around. So if I wanted to ask Ben to turn the vehicle around, I could tell him, chuck a Yui. And it basically means, make a U-turn. So you can use your ute to chuck a Yui. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to follow me on my socials and also visit julzdownunder.com to read frequent blogs. And if you like the music that I use in this video, make sure you visit my SoundCloud at Julz Down Under. See ya!